I never thought watching my brother pick a jury would change how I saw justice forever. Sarah Martinez had always been the quiet one in our family, the sister who preferred reading legal briefs to reality TV, who chose Saturday nights in law libraries over parties. But nothing prepared her for what happened in Courtroom 4B that Tuesday morning, when she thought she was just observing another routine civil case. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The defendant's attorney kept circling back to her like a shark sensing blood in the water. Every question felt designed to expose some hidden agenda, some predetermined bias that would make her unfit to serve. She sat there in the jury box feeling smaller with each accusation, while her brother Michael shifted uncomfortably in the gallery behind her. What the attorney didn't know was that Sarah carried stories she'd never shared, medals she'd never displayed, and a service record that would have silenced his doubts in an instant. The morning started like any other Tuesday in downtown Phoenix. I'd driven Michael to the courthouse for jury duty, planning to sit in the gallery and grade papers while he went through the selection process. As a high school history teacher, I had the luxury of flexible scheduling during winter break, and I figured watching real legal proceedings might give me some material for my government classes. Michael had been grumbling about jury duty for weeks, convinced he'd be dismissed anyway because of his job as a police detective. Most attorneys didn't want cops on their juries, he'd explained. Too much potential for bias one way or another. I'd teased him about getting a free day off work, but honestly, I was curious to see the process myself. The Maricopa County Courthouse buzzed with the usual Tuesday morning energy. Lawyers wheeled briefcases past security checkpoints, clerks hurried between courtrooms with stacks of files, and potential jurors wandered the hallways looking lost and slightly annoyed. The building smelled like industrial coffee and nervous energy, that particular mixture of fluorescent lighting and civic duty that made everything feel slightly surreal. Courtroom 4B was smaller than I'd expected, with wood paneling that had seen better decades and chairs that squeaked whenever someone shifted position. The case was a civil matter, something about a car accident and disputed insurance claims. Nothing that should have required drama, but as I'd learned, drama has a way of finding you when you least expect it. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, called the session to order with the efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times before. Her nameplate read Judge Patricia Chin, and she had the kind of presence that made everyone sit up straighter without her having to say a word. Michael was called as juror number 7. I watched him take his seat in the jury box, looking professional in his gray slacks and button-down shirt. He'd left his detective badge at home, but there was something about his posture, the way he scanned the room, that probably screamed law enforcement to anyone paying attention. The plaintiff's attorney went first, a middle-aged man with an expensive suit and the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He asked the standard questions about employment, family, prior jury service. Michael answered honestly when asked about his job, and I could see the attorney make a note on his legal pad. Then came the defendant's attorney, and that's when things started to get interesting. Attorney Rebecca Walsh was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s, with auburn hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that made her questions feel like surgical instruments. She wore a navy blue suit that looked like it cost more than my monthly salary, and she moved around the courtroom with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She started with the usual queries, working her way down the line of potential jurors. When she reached Michael, her tone shifted slightly. Not dramatically, but enough that I noticed. "Detective Martinez," she said, consulting her notes, "you've been with PEXP for how long?" 12 years, Michael replied. "And in that time, you've testified in court cases?" "Yes, ma'am." "Many times?" Michael shrugged. "Comes with the job." Walsh nodded, making another note. "Would you say you have a natural tendency to believe police testimony over civilian testimony?" I could see Michael thinking through his answer. "I'd say I have experience evaluating evidence and testimony from all sources. But surely you'd agree that your professional relationships with other law enforcement officers might create some bias in a case involving police conduct." "This case doesn't involve police conduct," Michael pointed out. "No, but it involves questions of credibility, doesn't it? Whose version of events to believe?" Walsh was warming up now, and I could see where this was heading. Judge Chen intervened. Counselor, this case involves a traffic accident and insurance coverage. Could you clarify the relevance of these questions? Walsh smiled that sharp smile. Of course, Your Honor. I'm simply exploring potential bias that might affect this juror's ability to fairly evaluate conflicting testimony about the circumstances of the accident. She turned back to Michael. Detective Martinez, do you have family members who might influence your perspective on law enforcement? I'm not sure what you mean. Siblings, parents, anyone else in your family with military or law enforcement backgrounds? I felt a chill run down my spine. Where was she going with this? My sister served in the Navy, Michael said carefully. Walsh's eyes lit up like she'd struck gold. Your sister, is she here today? Michael glanced back at me, and I felt every eye in the courtroom follow his gaze. I gave a small wave, suddenly wishing I'd chosen a different seat. Yes, she's in the gallery. And how long did she serve? 22 years. 22 years, Walsh repeated the number like it proved something significant. That's quite a career. What was her specialty? Michael hesitated. She was a JAG officer. I closed my eyes. Of course he'd have to mention that. A military attorney, she said, her voice taking on a tone that suggested she'd found exactly what she was looking for. So your sister, who was here observing these proceedings, served as a military prosecutor and defense attorney for over 22 years. Yes. And I assume you've discussed this case with her? We've barely discussed anything, Michael said, which was true. I'd only learned the basic details on the drive over. Walsh wasn't satisfied. But surely, Detective Martinez, you can see how having a sister who spent 22 years as a military attorney, someone whose entire career was built around analyzing evidence and making legal arguments, might influence your perspective on legal proceedings. Someone who's essentially been trained to argue both sides of any case. I wanted to stand up and object, but I wasn't a party to these proceedings. I was just an observer who was suddenly feeling very observed. Your Honor, the plaintiff's attorney interjected, I fail to see how the juror's sister's military service is relevant to his ability to serve on this jury. Walsh turned toward the judge. Your Honor, I'm exploring potential bias. Detective Martinez has a sister who's not only a trained attorney, but specifically a military attorney, someone whose entire career was built around analyzing evidence and making legal arguments. She's here today observing these proceedings. It's reasonable to question whether the juror's family relationships might compromise his objectivity. Judge Chen looked thoughtful. Detective Martinez, have you discussed this case with your sister? No, Your Honor. She's only here because she had the day off and offered to drive me to the courthouse. But you have discussed legal matters with her in the past. Michael nodded. Sure, family conversations.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Walsh pounced. And in those conversations, has your sister ever expressed opinions about civilian versus military justice, about the reliability of different types of witnesses, about proper procedures for evaluating evidence? I could see where this was leading, and I didn't like it. Walsh was painting me as some sort of puppet master, someone who would unduly influence Michael's judgment based on my military legal training. My sister's a teacher now, Michael said, a note of defensiveness creeping into his voice. She teaches high school history. But she was a JAG officer for 22 years, Walsh pressed. That kind of training doesn't just disappear when you change careers, does it? Tell me, Detective Martinez, what rank did your sister achieve during her service? Michael looked back at me again, and I could see him debating how much to reveal. We'd always been private about my service, partly because I preferred to leave that life behind me when I left the Navy, and partly because it sometimes complicated things when people learned too much about my background. She retired as a captain, he said finally. Captain? Walsh repeated. That's equivalent to a colonel in the Army, isn't it? Quite a high rank for a JAG officer. I wouldn't know, Michael said, which was mostly true. He'd never been particularly interested in military rankings. But Walsh wasn't done. Detective Martinez, during your sister's 22 years of service, did she ever serve in combat zones? Objection, the plaintiff's attorney said, standing up. Your Honor, this line of questioning is becoming irrelevant to the juror's qualifications. Sustained, Judge Chen said. but I could tell she was curious now too. Walsh nodded, but didn't look deterred. "Your Honor, I'd like to approach the bench." Both attorneys walked to the judge's bench for a whispered conference that lasted several minutes. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see Walsh gesturing toward the jury box and occasionally glancing in my direction. When they returned to their positions, Judge Chen addressed the courtroom. "We'll take a 15-minute recess while I consider the issues raised by defense counsel." The courtroom began to empty, but I stayed in my seat, feeling like everyone was staring at me. Michael made his way over from the jury box, his expression a mixture of confusion and irritation. "What the hell was that about?" he asked, settling into the seat next to me. "I think Attorney Walsh is trying to get you dismissed from the jury," I said. "Yeah, I figured that much, but why is she making such a big deal about your service?" I sighed. "Because she thinks having a former JAG officer for a sister might influence your judgment. She's probably worried that I'll coach you on how to evaluate evidence or spot inconsistencies in testimony." "Would you?" I looked at him seriously. "Michael, you're a detective. You've been evaluating evidence and testimony for 12 years. You don't need me to teach you how to spot a lie." "I know that, but she doesn't seem to think so." The bailiff called everyone back to order, and Michael returned to the jury box. Judge Chen had apparently made her decision during the recess. After considering the concerns raised by defense counsel, she announced, "I'm going to allow additional questioning of juror number 7 regarding potential bias." Walsh stood up with a satisfied expression. "Thank you, Your Honor." "Detective Martinez, I'd like to return to the question of your sister's military service." Michael nodded, resigned to whatever was coming next. "You mentioned that your sister served as a JAG officer for 22 years and retired as a captain. During that time, did she serve multiple deployments overseas?" "Yes." "In combat zones?" The plaintiff's attorney started to object again, but Judge Chen waved him off. "I'll allow it." "Yes," Michael said. "She served in Iraq and Afghanistan." "Multiple tours?" "Yes." Walsh was building to something, and I had a sinking feeling I knew what it was. She was going to paint me as some sort of hardened military prosecutor, someone whose influence on Michael would make him biased toward authority figures and against civilian complaints. "Detective Martinez, would you say your sister's military experience has shaped your own views on law and order?" "I think my own experience as a police officer has shaped my views on law and order. But surely growing up with someone who spent over 2 decades prosecuting and defending military personnel has influenced your perspective on justice?" Michael was quiet for a moment, and I could see him struggling with how to answer. The truth was, we'd had many conversations over the years about justice, about the differences between civilian and military legal systems, and about the challenges of serving in both law enforcement and the military. But those were private family discussions, not some sort of systematic indoctrination. My sister has never told me how to do my job, and she's never expressed any opinions that would make me biased in a civil case about a car accident. Walsh smiled, that sharp smile again. "But Detective Martinez, you're asking this court to believe that 22 years of conversations with a military attorney, someone trained in both prosecution and defense, someone who served multiple combat tours and risen to the rank of captain, has had no influence on your approach to evaluating evidence and testimony?" "That's not what I'm saying." "Then what are you saying?" Michael looked frustrated, and I didn't blame him. Walsh was twisting his words, making it sound like having me for a sister automatically disqualified him from objective judgment. "I'm saying that my sister's service doesn't make me biased toward or against either party in this case. But it does give you access to sophisticated legal analysis that other jurors wouldn't have, doesn't it? If you have questions about evidence or procedure, you could simply ask your sister for guidance." "I wouldn't do that." "But you could. I could also Google legal questions, but that doesn't mean I would." A few people in the gallery chuckled at that, but Walsh wasn't amused. Detective Martinez, let me ask you directly. If your sister advised you that certain testimony seemed inconsistent with her experience as a military prosecutor, would you consider her opinion? Objection, the plaintiff's attorney said, standing up. Your Honor, this line of questioning is becoming irrelevant to the juror's qualifications. Sustained, Judge Chen said, but I could tell she was curious now too. Walsh nodded but didn't look deterred. Your Honor, I'd like to approach the bench. After considering the concerns raised by defense counsel, she announced, I'm going to allow additional questioning of juror number 7 regarding potential bias. Walsh stood up with a satisfied expression. Thank you, Your Honor. Detective Martinez, I'd like to return to the question of your sister's military service. Michael nodded, resigned to whatever was coming next. You mentioned that your sister served as a JAG officer for 22 years and retired as a captain. During that time, did she serve multiple deployments overseas? Yes. In combat zones? The plaintiff's attorney started to object again, but Judge Chen waved him off. I'll allow it. Yes, Michael said. She served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Multiple tours? Yes. Walsh was building to something, and I had a sinking feeling I knew what it was. She was going to paint me as some sort of hardened military prosecutor, someone whose influence on Michael would make him biased toward authority figures and against civilian complaints. Detective Martinez, would you say your sister's military experience has shaped your own views on law and order? I think my own experience as a police officer has shaped my views on law and order. But surely growing up with someone who spent over 2 decades prosecuting and defending military personnel has influenced your perspective on justice? Michael was quiet for a moment, and I could see him struggling with how to answer. The truth was, we'd had many conversations over the years about justice, about the differences between civilian and military legal systems, and about the challenges of serving in both law enforcement and the military. But those were private family discussions, not some sort of systematic indoctrination. My sister has never told me how to do my job, and she's never expressed any opinions that would make me biased in a civil case about a car accident. Walsh smiled that sharp smile again. But Detective Martinez, you're asking this court to believe that 22 years of conversations with a military attorney, someone trained in both prosecution and defense, someone who served multiple combat tours and risen to the rank of captain, has had no influence on your approach to evaluating evidence and testimony? That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? Michael looked frustrated, and I didn't blame him. Walsh was twisting his words, making it sound like having me for a sister automatically disqualified him from objective judgment. I'm saying that my sister's service doesn't make me biased toward or against either party in this case. But it does give you access to sophisticated legal analysis that other jurors wouldn't have, doesn't it? If you have questions about evidence or procedure, you could simply ask your sister for guidance. I wouldn't do that. But you could. I could also Google legal questions, but that doesn't mean I would. A few people in the gallery chuckled at that, but Walsh wasn't amused. Detective Martinez, let me ask you directly. If your sister advised you that certain testimony seemed inconsistent with her experience as a military prosecutor, would you consider her opinion? Objection, the plaintiff's attorney said, standing up. Your Honor, this line of questioning is becoming irrelevant to the juror's qualifications. Sustained, Judge Chen said, but I could tell she was curious now too. Walsh nodded, but didn't look deterred. Your Honor, I'd like to approach the bench. Maniko Laughtmeg looked over at me again.
That makes it sound more formal than it was. But the instruction occurred? Informal conversations occurred. Conversations in which your sister, drawing on 22 years of experience as a military prosecutor and defense attorney, shared her expertise on evaluating evidence and assessing witness credibility. You're making it sound like she gave me a course in legal analysis. We're siblings, we talk about work sometimes. Walsh turned to address the judge. Your Honor, I believe this demonstrates a clear source of potential bias. Detective Martinez has not only been exposed to sophisticated legal training through his sister's military service, but he has ongoing access to that expertise. His sister is here today observing these proceedings. There's no way to ensure that his judgment won't be influenced by her presence and her background. The plaintiff's attorney stood up. Your Honor, this is absurd. Having a family member with legal training doesn't disqualify someone from jury service. By this logic, anyone with a lawyer in the family would be automatically excluded from juries. But not just any lawyer, Walsh countered. A military attorney with over 2 decades of experience in both prosecution and defense. Someone who served multiple combat tours and achieved the rank of captain. This isn't comparable to having a cousin who does real estate law. Judge Chen looked thoughtful. I'll admit this is an unusual situation. Detective Martinez, I need to ask you directly. Do you believe your sister's presence in this courtroom and her background as a military attorney would influence your ability to render an impartial verdict based solely on the evidence presented in this case? Michael was quiet for a long moment. I could see him weighing his words carefully, understanding that his answer might determine whether he'd be dismissed from the jury. No, Your Honor, he said finally. I believe I can base my verdict solely on the evidence presented in this courtroom. Judge Chen nodded. And if selected for this jury, would you commit to not discussing this case with your sister or seeking her input on any aspect of the proceedings? Yes, Your Honor. Walsh wasn't ready to give up. Your Honor, I respectfully request permission to ask the juror's sister a few questions. If she's going to be present during these proceedings, I think the court should understand her background and any potential influence she might have. I felt my stomach drop. This was exactly what I'd been hoping to avoid. Judge Chen looked surprised. Counselor, the juror's sister isn't on trial here. No, Your Honor, but her presence and background are directly relevant to this juror's qualifications. If she's as highly trained as Detective Martinez suggests, and if she's going to be observing these proceedings, I think the court deserves to understand the full scope of potential bias. The plaintiff's attorney objected again. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. There's no precedent for questioning a juror's family members during voir dire. It's unusual, Judge Chen agreed, but given the unique circumstances, I'm going to allow limited questioning. She looked directly at me. Ma'am, would you please come forward? I felt like every eye in the courtroom was on me as I made my way from the gallery to the witness stand. The bailiff swore me in, and I found myself facing Attorney Walsh's sharp smile. Please state your name for the record. Sarah Martinez. And your relationship to juror number 7. He's my brother. Ms. Martinez, you served in the United States Navy for 22 years. Yes. As a JAG officer. Yes. What was your final rank? I hesitated for just a moment, knowing that my answer would probably seal Michael's fate on this jury. I retired as a Rear Admiral. The courtroom went completely silent. Even Walsh looked surprised, and I could see her mentally recalculating her strategy. Rear Admiral, she repeated slowly. Not captain, as your brother indicated, but Rear Admiral. My brother isn't familiar with Navy rankings. To him, I was just his sister who served in the military. Walsh was clearly thrown by this revelation, but she pressed on. Admiral Martinez, Rear Admiral is quite a high rank for a JAG officer, isn't it? I was fortunate to serve during a time when my experience was valued. And what was the nature of that experience? What types of cases did you handle during your 22 years of service? I could feel the weight of the courtroom's attention, and I realized that there was no way to minimize what was about to come out. I handled a wide range of military legal matters. Courts-martial, appeals, legal reviews of military operations. Combat zones? Yes. Multiple deployments? Yes. Admiral Martinez, without going into classified details, can you tell the court the scope of your responsibilities during your final years of service? I looked at Judge Chen, who nodded for me to continue. I served as the senior JAG officer for Naval Special Warfare Command. Another silence fell over the courtroom. Walsh was clearly out of her depth now, but she couldn't back down. Naval Special Warfare Command, she repeated. That would include the Navy SEALs. Yes. So you were responsible for legal oversight of some of the most classified and sensitive military operations conducted by the United States. Within my area of responsibility, yes. Walsh was quiet for a moment, and I could see her trying to figure out how to use this information to support her argument about bias. The problem was she'd been expecting a typical military attorney, not someone who'd reached flag rank and handled some of the most complex legal issues in the military. Admiral Martinez, given your extensive experience and high rank, would you say you have strong opinions about the proper way to evaluate evidence and assess witness credibility? I believe in following proper procedures and applying the law fairly. But surely someone with your background would have sophisticated techniques for analyzing testimony and evidence that far exceed what a typical civilian juror might possess. I have experience, yes. And if your brother were selected for this jury, and if he had questions about the proceedings, would you be able to resist offering your analysis? I looked directly at her. Attorney Walsh, I've spent 22 years following rules and respecting proper procedures. If my brother were selected for this jury, I would no more interfere with his deliberations than I would interfere with any other legal proceeding. That would be entirely inappropriate. But the temptation would be there. The temptation for improper conduct is always there for everyone. The question is whether you have the discipline and integrity to resist it. Walsh was frustrated. Her strategy was backfiring because instead of exposing some sort of bias or improper influence, she was highlighting my commitment to proper legal procedures.
Admiral Martinez, let me ask you directly. If your brother is selected for this jury, will you discuss this case with him in any way? No, Your Honor. Will you offer any analysis or opinion about the evidence or the proceedings? No, Your Honor. And do you believe your presence in this courtroom would influence his judgment? I thought about that question carefully. Your Honor, my brother has been a police detective for 12 years. He's testified in dozens of trials and evaluated thousands of pieces of evidence. He doesn't need my guidance to do his job, and he's never asked for it. I believe he's perfectly capable of serving as an impartial juror regardless of my presence or background. Judge Chen nodded. Thank you, Admiral. You may return to your seat. As I walked back to the gallery, I could hear Walsh making one last argument to the judge about the potential for bias and the unusual nature of the situation. But something had shifted in the courtroom. The revelation of my rank and background had changed the dynamic in ways that Walsh clearly hadn't anticipated. Judge Chen called for another recess to consider the arguments, and this time the whispered conversations in the gallery were about me rather than the case. I heard fragments of discussion about Naval Special Warfare Command and flag rank and what it meant to be a rear admiral. When court reconvened, Judge Chen had made her decision. After careful consideration of the arguments presented by both counsel, I find that Detective Martinez is qualified to serve on this jury. While his sister's background is certainly impressive, there's no evidence that her presence or her military service would compromise his ability to render an impartial verdict. The court notes Admiral Martinez's commitment to proper legal procedures and her assurance that she will not discuss the case with her brother. Walsh looked like she wanted to argue further, but Judge Chen's tone made it clear the decision was final. Furthermore, the judge continued, I want to take a moment to acknowledge Admiral Martinez's service to our country. 22 years of military service, culminating in flag rank, represents an extraordinary commitment to duty and sacrifice. While her background was raised as a potential concern, I believe her demonstrated commitment to proper legal procedures actually supports, rather than undermine, confidence in this process. The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause, led by several veterans who'd been observing the proceedings. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and gratitude. Walsh's co-counsel, a man who'd been silent throughout the questioning, leaned over and whispered something in her ear. She looked surprised, then embarrassed, then walked over to where I was sitting. Admiral Martinez, she said quietly, I owe you an apology.
My questioning was overly aggressive, and I should have shown more respect for your service. I stood up and extended my hand. Attorney Walsh, you were doing your job and representing your client's interests. I respect that. She shook my hand, then turned to address the court. Your Honor, the defense withdraws any objection to Detective Martinez serving on this jury. And that's how my brother ended up serving on a jury where the most contentious issue wasn't the evidence in the case, but whether having a retired Navy Rear Admiral for a sister made him unfit to serve. The trial itself was anticlimactic after all the drama of jury selection. The case was resolved in 2 days with a verdict that satisfied both parties. But the real resolution came afterward when Attorney Walsh approached me outside the courthouse. Admiral Martinez, she said, I wanted to apologize again for my questioning. I made assumptions about your background and your relationship with your brother that were unfair. What kind of assumptions? I thought you were probably a typical military attorney, someone who might have strong opinions about civilian legal proceedings. I was prepared to argue that military training created bias towards authority and order. I smiled. And when you learned I was a flag officer? When I learned you were a Rear Admiral who'd overseen legal operations for Naval Special Warfare Command, I realized I was completely out of my depth. Someone doesn't reach that rank without extraordinary judgment and integrity. Attorney Walsh, you couldn't have known my background, and you were right to explore potential bias. That's your job. But I should have approached it with more respect. You showed respect when it mattered. When you learned the facts, you adjusted your position. That's what good attorneys do. As we walked away from the courthouse, Michael shook his head in amazement. 22 years I've known about your military service, and I never realized how big a deal it was until today. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal. I just wanted to observe a jury trial and maybe learn something from my government classes. Instead, you ended up being the most interesting thing about the trial. I laughed. I'm pretty sure that's not how it's supposed to work. But as I thought about the day's events, I realized that maybe it had worked exactly the way it was supposed to. Justice isn't just about following procedures and evaluating evidence. It's also about recognizing when assumptions and prejudices are clouding our judgment and having the courage to adjust course when we learn we were wrong. Attorney Walsh started the day assuming that my military background would create bias in my brother. She ended it understanding that military service, properly understood, actually reinforces the values that make the justice system work: integrity, fairness, and commitment to proper procedures. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. We all carry assumptions about each other, about what different backgrounds and experiences mean. But justice requires us to look deeper, to question our assumptions, and to recognize that sometimes the very things we fear might compromise fairness are actually the things that strengthen it. My brother served on that jury with distinction, rendering a fair verdict based solely on the evidence presented. And I learned that sometimes the most powerful way to serve your country isn't in uniform, but in showing up to fulfill your civic duties with integrity and respect for the process. That's what real service looks like, whether you're wearing Admiral stripes or sitting in a jury box. It's about putting aside your personal interests and doing what's right, even when it's not easy, even when you're being questioned and doubted, even when the stakes seem small. Because in the end, justice isn't about the size of the case or the importance of the parties involved. It's about treating every person and every situation with the dignity and fairness they deserve. And that's a lesson worth learning whether you're in a courtroom or anywhere else life takes you. The silence that followed my revelation stretched across the courtroom like morning fog rolling over still water. I could see Attorney Walsh's mind racing, trying to recalibrate her entire strategy now that she understood the magnitude of what she was dealing with. Rear Admiral wasn't just a rank. It was a testament to decades of service at the highest levels of military legal operations, and everyone in that courtroom was beginning to grasp the implications. Judge Chen recovered first, her judicial composure masking what I suspected was genuine surprise. She'd probably presided over thousands of jury selections, but I doubted she'd ever encountered a situation like this. The irony wasn't lost on me either. Walsh had been trying to demonstrate that my presence would create unfair bias, but her aggressive questioning was having the opposite effect, highlighting my commitment to proper procedures and ethical conduct. Admiral Martinez, in your role overseeing legal operations for Naval Special Warfare Command, you would have dealt with highly classified cases involving national security. That's correct.
cases where the stakes were considerably higher than a civil dispute over insurance coverage. The stakes were different, I said carefully, but I would never characterize any legal proceeding as unimportant. Every case matters to the people involved. It was a subtle correction, but I could see it land. Walsh was trying to suggest that someone accustomed to high-stakes military legal matters might view a civil car accident case as trivial, but my response indicated exactly the opposite philosophy. Of course, Walsh said, though she didn't sound entirely convinced of her own argument anymore. But surely someone with your background would approach legal questions differently than an average citizen. I would approach them professionally and objectively, just as I've been trained to do, but with significantly more sophisticated analytical tools than a typical juror. I considered that for a moment. Attorney Walsh, do you believe that education and experience disqualifies someone from jury service? Because if that's your argument, then we need to exclude teachers, business executives, anyone who's developed critical thinking skills through their career. A murmur of approval rippled through the gallery. I wasn't trying to score points, but I was pointing out the logical flaw in her reasoning. If professional competence created bias, then only inexperienced, uneducated people could serve on juries, which would hardly improve the quality of justice.
Walsh seemed to recognize she was losing ground. Admiral, let me ask you this. During your 22 years of service, did you ever encounter situations where military personnel received different treatment under military law than they might have received in civilian courts? It was a clever question, designed to explore whether I might harbor prejudices about civilian legal proceedings. The military justice system and civilian legal system serve different purposes and operate under different constraints, I said. Both are designed to achieve justice within their respective contexts. But you must have opinions about which system is more effective. I have experience with both systems. That experience has taught me to respect the procedures and principles that govern each one. Judge Chen intervened before Walsh could continue down that path. Counselor, I think we've explored this line of questioning sufficiently. Do you have other concerns about this juror's qualifications? Walsh glanced at her co-counsel, who shook his head almost imperceptibly. She was clearly struggling with how to proceed. Her original strategy had been based on portraying me as potentially biased or overly influential, but my rank and background were actually undermining that argument. Someone doesn't reach flag rank in the military legal system without demonstrating exceptional judgment and integrity. Your Honor, Walsh said finally, I'd like to request a brief sidebar to discuss the unique circumstances of this situation. Judge Chen nodded and called both attorneys to approach the bench. Their whispered conference lasted several minutes, during which I could feel the attention of the entire courtroom. Some people were clearly curious about my background, others seemed impressed by the revelation of my rank, and a few appeared to be veterans themselves, judging by their posture and the way they were looking at me with recognition and respect. Michael caught my eye from the jury box and gave me a slight smile. He'd been fielding questions about my service for years without really understanding the details himself. I'd always been his older sister who happened to be in the Navy, not some high-ranking officer with significant responsibilities. It was probably strange for him to see me in this context, being treated as a person of authority and expertise rather than just family. When the attorneys returned from their sidebar, Walsh looked resigned but not defeated. She'd clearly been given some guidance from the judge about how to proceed. Admiral Martinez, she said, I have just a few more questions. During your service, did you ever have to make decisions about the guilt or innocence of military personnel? As a JAG officer, I participated in courts-martial and legal proceedings where such determinations were made, yes. And in those proceedings, were you ever in a position where you had to weigh conflicting testimony from witnesses? That's a fundamental part of any legal proceeding. So you have extensive experience in exactly the type of analysis that jurors are asked to perform. I have experience in legal analysis, yes. Walsh paused, and I could see her making a decision. Admiral Martinez, given your extensive background in legal proceedings and your high rank, don't you think your presence on this jury, or even in this courtroom, might be intimidating to other jurors? Might they defer to your judgment rather than forming their own opinions? It was actually a thoughtful question, and one that got to the heart of a real concern. Attorney Walsh, I'm not serving on this jury. My brother is. And if I were serving on a jury, I would expect my fellow jurors to form their own judgments just as I would form mine. But surely you understand that your rank and experience would carry significant weight in any group discussion. Which is why I'm not serving on this jury, I pointed out. My brother is, and he's perfectly capable of forming his own judgments without my input. Walsh nodded slowly. Admiral, if your brother is selected for this jury, and if you remain in this courtroom to observe the proceedings, can you guarantee that you won't inadvertently influence his thinking through your reactions to testimony or evidence? It was the smartest question she'd asked all day, because it addressed a real possibility. Even without speaking, experienced legal professionals can communicate volumes through their body language and facial expressions. Attorney Walsh, I can guarantee that I will conduct myself with the same professionalism I've maintained throughout my career. If my presence in this courtroom poses any risk of influencing the proceedings, I'm prepared to leave. Judge Chen looked surprised. Admiral Martinez, you're not required to leave. You have every right to observe these public proceedings. Your Honor, I understand my rights, but I also understand the importance of maintaining the integrity of the judicial process. If my presence creates even the appearance of impropriety, I'm willing to withdraw from the courtroom. The offer seemed to catch everyone off guard, including Walsh. She'd been trying to demonstrate that my presence was problematic, but my willingness to remove myself from the situation effectively neutralized her argument. That's very considerate, Admiral, Walsh said, but I don't think that's necessary. Then what are you asking for? Walsh looked frustrated. I'm trying to ensure that Detective Martinez can serve as an impartial juror without being influenced by your background and presence. And I've told you that he can. I've also offered to remove myself from the courtroom if you're concerned about my presence. What else would you like me to do? The question hung in the air because Walsh clearly didn't have a good answer. She'd painted herself into a corner by pursuing a line of questioning that ultimately highlighted my integrity rather than raising doubts about my influence. Judge Chen seemed to recognize that the questioning had reached its natural conclusion. Counselor Walsh, do you have any other concerns about juror number 7's qualifications? Walsh looked at her notes, then at me, then at Michael in the jury box. No, Your Honor, the defense has no further questions. Very well. Admiral Martinez, thank you for your patience with this process. You may return to your seat. As I walked back to the gallery, I could hear whispered conversations starting up throughout the courtroom. The word Admiral seemed to be repeated frequently, along with Navy SEALs and special warfare. I'd become an object of curiosity and, judging by some of the expressions I saw, respect. But the most interesting reaction came from the plaintiff himself, an elderly man who'd been sitting quietly with his attorney throughout the proceedings. As I passed his table, he stood up and extended his hand. Admiral, he said quietly, thank you for your service. It was a simple gesture, but it had a profound effect on the atmosphere in the courtroom. Suddenly, this wasn't just about jury selection anymore. It was about recognition of service and sacrifice, about the obligations we have to each other as citizens, about the different ways people serve their country. Walsh noticed the interaction, and I could see her calculating whether it helped or hurt her position. The plaintiff had just shown public respect for someone whose brother she was trying to exclude from the jury. It was a complication she clearly hadn't anticipated. Judge Chen called for another brief recess while she considered the arguments that had been presented. During the break, several people approached me with questions about my service. A young man in Army fatigues who was observing the proceedings introduced himself as a recent veteran and thanked me for my leadership in the military legal community. An older woman mentioned that her son was a Navy lawyer and asked if I might have known him. A court clerk who'd been taking notes throughout the questioning stopped by to say that her father had been a Navy veteran and would have been proud to see me in uniform. Each interaction was brief and respectful, but collectively they created a sense that something significant was happening in this courtroom. Walsh's attempt to portray my background as problematic had instead highlighted the service and sacrifice that military personnel, including military legal professionals, make on behalf of their fellow citizens.
Michael found me during the recess and shook his head in amazement. "You know, I always knew you'd done important work in the Navy, but I never really understood the scope of it until today." "It was just my job," I said. "Just your job? Sarah, you were a Rear Admiral. You oversaw legal operations for the Navy SEALs. That's not just a job, that's a calling."
I smiled. Every job can be a calling if you approach it the right way. Is that what you tell your students? Among other things. When court reconvened, Judge Chen had clearly made her decision about how to proceed. She addressed the courtroom with the authority of someone who'd thought carefully about the issues involved. After considering the extensive questioning of both Detective Martinez and Admiral Martinez, I find that Detective Martinez is qualified to serve on this jury. While Admiral Martinez's background is certainly distinguished, there's no evidence that her presence or her relationship with the potential juror would compromise the integrity of these proceedings. Walsh started to stand, but Judge Chen continued before she could speak. Furthermore, I want to address some broader issues that have been raised during this voir dire process. This court operates on the principle that citizens from all walks of life can serve effectively as jurors when they commit to following the law and evaluating evidence objectively. Professional experience, education, and even distinguished military service don't disqualify someone from jury duty. They're assets that strengthen our justice system. The judge's words carried special weight because they came from someone who'd spent decades observing how different types of people performed as jurors. Her endorsement of experience and expertise as positive qualities rather than sources of bias was a direct rebuke to Walsh's strategy. "Admiral Martinez," Judge Chen continued, "your willingness to remove yourself from these proceedings if your presence posed any risk to their integrity demonstrates exactly the kind of judgment and professionalism that makes our military legal system one of the most respected in the world. Your presence in this courtroom is welcome, and your brother's service on this jury, should he be selected, will be valued." The spontaneous applause that erupted was quickly quieted by the bailiff, but the message was clear. What had started as an attempt to exclude Michael from jury service had become an acknowledgement of the value that military families bring to civic participation. Walsh made one final attempt to salvage her position. "Your Honor, the defense appreciates the court's confidence in the jury system, but we maintain that the unique circumstances of this case warrant special consideration." "What unique circumstances are those, Counselor?" "The combination of Detective Martinez's law enforcement background and Admiral Martinez's military legal expertise creates a situation where—" "Where what?" Judge Chen's tone had sharpened. "Where a police detective with 12 years of experience evaluating evidence might be influenced by his sister's commitment to legal integrity and proper procedures? I fail to see how that creates a problem for your client." Walsh realized she was fighting a losing battle. "No further questions, Your Honor." The final phase of jury selection proceeded smoothly after that. Michael was selected as one of 12 jurors, along with 11 other citizens who would evaluate the evidence and render a verdict in the civil case. As the jury was sworn in, I felt a sense of pride watching my brother take the oath to serve faithfully and impartially. But the real resolution came after the session ended, when Attorney Walsh approached me outside the courtroom. Her co-counsel, who I learned was named David Chen, the judge's nephew, accompanied her. "Admiral Martinez," Walsh said, "I owe you a significant apology. My questioning today was inappropriate and disrespectful. You were representing your client's interests. That's your job. No, it was more than that. I made assumptions about your background and your relationship with your brother that were unfounded. I let my preconceptions about military personnel cloud my judgment." It was a gracious admission, and I respected her for making it. "What kind of preconceptions?" Walsh looked uncomfortable, but continued. "I assumed that military legal training would create bias toward authority and order. I thought having a former JAG officer observing the proceedings would intimidate civilian jurors or unduly influence a family member." "And now?"
Now, I understand that military legal training actually reinforces the values that make our justice system work: integrity, objectivity, commitment to proper procedures. Your willingness to remove yourself from the courtroom if your presence posed any risk to their integrity demonstrates exactly the kind of judgment and professionalism that makes our military legal system one of the most respected in the world. Your presence in this courtroom is welcome, and your brother's service on this jury, should he be selected, will be valued." David Chen nodded in agreement. "Admiral, I wanted to add my own apology. Rebecca and I should have done more research about your background before pursuing this line of questioning. If we'd understood your rank and responsibilities, we would have approached this very differently." "How so?" "We would have recognized that someone doesn't reach flag rank in the military legal system without demonstrating exceptional integrity and judgment. We would have understood that your presence would enhance rather than compromise the proceedings." It was a thoughtful analysis, and I appreciated their willingness to acknowledge their mistake. "I understand why you were concerned. The relationship between a juror and a family member with legal expertise could potentially create problems. You were right to explore that possibility. But we went about it the wrong way," Walsh said. "We should have asked respectful questions about potential bias rather than making accusations about improper influence. You adjusted your approach when you learned more information. That's what good attorneys do." "That's very generous of you to say." As we continued talking, I learned that both attorneys were relatively young in their careers and had limited experience with military legal matters. Walsh had graduated from law school 5 years earlier and primarily handled insurance defense cases. Chen had been practicing for 3 years and specialized in personal injury law. Neither had encountered a situation involving a high-ranking military legal officer. "Can I ask you something, Admiral? What was it like overseeing legal operations for Naval Special Warfare Command?" It was a question I didn't often get asked, partly because the work was sensitive, and partly because I had always preferred to keep my military career separate from my civilian life. But something about the day's events had made me more willing to discuss my service. "Challenging," I said. "The legal issues involved in special operations are incredibly complex. You're dealing with constitutional law, international law, rules of engagement, operational security, personnel matters, and classified information all at the same time. Every decision has potential national security implications. And you had to make those decisions? I had to provide legal guidance that would help operational commanders make those decisions. The stakes were high, and there was rarely a clear right answer. You had to analyze the law, understand the operational requirements, consider the political implications, and provide advice that would protect both the mission and the personnel involved." Chen looked fascinated. "How do you transition from that kind of responsibility to teaching high school?" I laughed. "You might be surprised how similar they are. Both involve working with young people who are trying to figure out their place in the world. Both require patience, clear communication, and the ability to maintain authority while remaining approachable. And both are ultimately about service, about helping others achieve their potential. But the scale is different. The scale is different, but the principles are the same. Whether you're advising a SEAL team commander or teaching a 16-year-old about the Constitution, you're working to ensure that people understand their responsibilities and make good decisions." We talked for another 20 minutes about military service, legal careers, and the challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life. Both attorneys were genuinely curious about my experience, and I found myself enjoying the conversation. It was rare to have the opportunity to discuss my military career with people who were intelligent and interested, but not themselves veterans. As we prepared to leave, Walsh made one final comment that stuck with me. "Admiral, I hope you know that your brother is lucky to have you as a sister. The integrity and professionalism you've shown today reflects well on your entire family." "Thank you," I said.
But I think the integrity and professionalism runs both ways. Michael's been serving his community as a police detective for 12 years. He doesn't need my guidance to do the right thing. But he has it anyway, doesn't he? I smiled. We all have guidance from the people who matter to us. The trick is knowing when to listen and when to think for yourself. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the day's events. What had started as a simple jury selection had become something much more significant. It had become a reminder of the different ways people serve their communities and the importance of recognizing and respecting that service. Michael called me that night after the first day of trial testimony. "You know," he said, "I think that whole controversy this morning actually helped me be a better juror." "How so?" "It reminded me that I represent more than just myself in that jury box. I represent my family, my profession, and my commitment to justice. It made me think more carefully about my responsibilities." "And how did the trial go?" "Pretty straightforward, actually. Car accident case, disputed liability, insurance coverage issues, nothing too complicated. But I found myself paying extra attention to the attorney's questions and the witness's answers. I kept thinking about what you said about professional integrity and doing the right thing." "I'm proud of you." "I'm proud of you, too. I never realized how much respect your rank commanded until I saw people's reactions today. It made me understand your service in a completely different way." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen grading papers and thinking about the unexpected turn the day had taken. I'd gone to observe a routine legal proceeding and ended up being questioned about my own background and qualifications. It had been uncomfortable at times, but ultimately enlightening. The experience had reminded me that we all carry our histories with us, whether we intend to or not. My military service wasn't just something I'd done in the past. It was part of who I was and how I approached the world. The same was true for Michael's law enforcement career, for Attorney Walsh's legal training, for Judge Chen's judicial experience. The question wasn't whether those backgrounds influenced our perspectives, because of course they did. The question was whether we could channel that influence in positive ways, using our experience to enhance rather than compromise our judgment. As I finished grading the last paper and prepared for bed, I realized that the day had taught me something important about civic duty and public service. Whether you're serving on a jury, practicing law, teaching school, or wearing a military uniform, you're part of a larger system that depends on everyone doing their job with integrity and professionalism. The jury system works not because jurors are blank slates without backgrounds or opinions, but because citizens from different walks of life can come together and commit to evaluating evidence fairly and following the law objectively. Military experience, law enforcement training, legal education, and every other kind of professional background can strengthen that process when they're guided by a commitment to justice and fairness. That's what Attorney Walsh had ultimately come to understand, and it's what Judge Chen had tried to communicate in her remarks about the value of experience and expertise in jury service. We're all products of our experiences, but that doesn't disqualify us from civic participation. It equips us for it, as long as we approach our responsibilities with humility, integrity, and respect for the process. The trial would continue for another day, and Michael would fulfill his duty as a juror with the same dedication he brought to his work as a detective. But the real lesson of the day wasn't about jury selection or legal procedures. It was about the obligations we have to each other as citizens and the different ways we can serve our communities while maintaining the highest standards of integrity and professionalism. The second day of trial arrived with the kind of crisp January morning that made Phoenix feel almost welcoming. I'd spent the evening reflecting on the previous day's events and decided to attend the proceedings again, partly out of curiosity about how the case would unfold, and partly because I wanted to support Michael in his role as a juror. After yesterday's drama, I expected the actual trial to be refreshingly straightforward. What I didn't expect was to find the courthouse parking lot buzzing with an unusual level of activity. News vans lined the street, and I could see reporters setting up cameras near the main entrance. At first, I assumed there must be some high-profile case being heard in one of the other courtrooms. But as I approached the building, I realized the attention was focused on Courtroom 4B. A young reporter with perfectly styled hair and a microphone thrust toward me as I tried to enter the building. "Excuse me, are you here for the Martinez trial? Do you have any comment on yesterday's jury selection proceedings?"
I politely declined to comment and made my way through security, wondering how news of yesterday's events had leaked so quickly. The answer became apparent when I saw David Chen, Attorney Walsh's co-counsel, speaking with a small group of reporters near the information desk. The case itself involves a straightforward insurance dispute, but yesterday's jury selection raised interesting questions about the role of military experience in civilian legal proceedings. I couldn't hear the rest of his comments, but it was clear that someone had decided yesterday's events were newsworthy. As I made my way to Courtroom 4B, I passed several people who looked at me with recognition. Word had apparently spread about the Rear Admiral who had been questioned during jury selection. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt different from the previous day. The gallery was more crowded, with several people I recognized as courthouse regulars who probably made it their business to attend interesting trials. Judge Chen was already at the bench, reviewing documents with her clerk, and both legal teams were huddled in animated discussions at their respective tables. Michael was in his seat in the jury box, looking slightly overwhelmed by the increased attention. When he spotted me, he gave a small wave and what looked like a relieved smile. I settled into the same seat I had occupied yesterday, noting that several other family members and friends of jurors had also returned to observe the proceedings. Attorney Walsh approached me before the session began, looking somewhat embarrassed. "Admiral Martinez, I hope you don't mind that David spoke with the press this morning. We felt it was important to provide some context for yesterday's proceedings." "What kind of context?" "We wanted to make it clear that our questioning wasn't meant to show disrespect for your service." David emphasized that the entire experience had been educational for our legal team and had actually reinforced our confidence in the jury system. I appreciated her concern, but I was curious about why they'd felt the need to involve the media at all. "Attorney Walsh, this is a civil case about car insurance. Why is there press interest?" She looked uncomfortable. "Apparently someone recorded part of yesterday's proceedings on their phone and posted it on social media. The video went viral overnight, especially in military and veteran communities. David and I have been fielding calls since 7 in the morning. The idea that my testimony had become social media content was both flattering and concerning. I'd always preferred to keep my military service private, and the thought of being discussed by strangers on the internet was unsettling." "What aspects of the proceedings were people responding to?" "Your willingness to remove yourself from the courtroom if your presence posed any risk to the integrity of the trial? Your patient responses to my questioning, even when it became aggressive? Judge Chen's comments about the value of military experience in civilian jury service. The whole interaction seemed to resonate with people who felt that military service isn't always properly understood or respected." Before I could respond, Judge Chen called the court to order, and the day's proceedings began. The actual trial testimony was indeed straightforward compared to the previous day's drama. The case involved a 3-car accident at a busy intersection, with disputed claims about who had been at fault and whether all the damages claimed were actually related to the accident. The plaintiff, an elderly man named Robert Harrison, testified that he'd been driving through a green light when the defendant's vehicle ran a red light and struck his car, causing a chain reaction that involved a third vehicle. He claimed ongoing back pain and medical expenses that his insurance company was refusing to cover, arguing that some of his injuries predated the accident. The defendant, a young woman named Jessica Torres, maintained that her light was yellow when she entered the intersection, and that Mr. Harrison had been speeding. Her attorney argued that Harrison's medical problems were primarily related to his age and pre-existing conditions rather than the accident. As I listened to the testimony, I found myself analyzing the case with the same systematic approach I'd developed during my military legal career. The key issues seemed to be timing, causation, and credibility. Who had the right of way at the intersection? Which of Harrison's medical problems were actually caused by the accident? How reliable were the various witness accounts? I could see Michael taking careful notes and paying close attention to each witness. His years as a detective had obviously taught him how to evaluate testimony and spot inconsistencies, and I was proud to see him fulfilling his civic duty with such seriousness. During the lunch recess, several reporters tried to interview me outside the courthouse, but I politely declined their requests. I wasn't interested in becoming a public figure or using my military service for a personal publicity. However,
I was approached by two people whose conversations I found much more meaningful.
The first was Maria Santos, a middle-aged woman whose son was currently serving as a Navy lawyer. "Admiral Martinez," she said, "I wanted to thank you for how you conducted yourself yesterday. My son is a lieutenant commander in the JAG Corps, and he's often frustrated by how little civilians understand about military legal work. Seeing you explain your service with such dignity and professionalism was inspiring. What's your son's specialty?" "Military justice and operational law. He's deployed right now, providing legal support to a special operations task force." I knew exactly the kind of challenges her son was facing. That's demanding work. The legal issues in special operations are incredibly complex, and the stakes are always high. Your son is performing a vital service. He says the hardest part is making sure that operational commanders understand the legal constraints without compromising mission effectiveness. That's exactly right. The law isn't an obstacle to operations, it's a framework that helps ensure operations are conducted properly. But it takes skill and experience to apply that framework in dynamic situations. We talked for several more minutes about her son's deployment and the challenges facing military legal professionals. It was a conversation that reminded me why I'd found my Navy career so rewarding. The work was difficult and often thankless, but it served a larger purpose that went beyond individual cases or legal victories. The second meaningful conversation was with James Mitchell, a retired Army colonel who'd been observing the trial. "Admiral," he said, "I served 30 years in the Army, and I wanted to say that your performance yesterday was a credit to the uniform." "Thank you, Colonel. What was your specialty?" "Infantry, mostly. But I worked with JAG officers throughout my career, and I learned to appreciate the difficult job you folks do. Balancing legal requirements with operational necessities isn't easy. It requires good communication and mutual respect. The best operational commanders I worked with understood that legal guidance was meant to help them accomplish their missions successfully, not to prevent them from taking action." Mitchell nodded. "That's exactly right. But it takes JAG officers with both legal expertise and operational understanding to make that work. From what I could see yesterday, you clearly had both." We discussed military legal work for a while longer, and Mitchell shared some stories about JAG officers who'd made significant contributions to his unit's effectiveness. It was gratifying to hear that the work military lawyers do is valued and understood by operational personnel. When court reconvened for the afternoon session, the focus shifted to expert testimony about the accident reconstruction and medical evidence. An accident reconstruction specialist explained how he'd analyzed the physical evidence from the scene to determine the sequence of events and the approximate speeds of the vehicles involved. His testimony was technical but compelling, using computer models and crash test data to support his conclusions about how the accident had occurred. According to his analysis, the defendant's vehicle had indeed entered the intersection after the light had changed to red, and the impact patterns suggested that the plaintiff had been traveling at or below the speed limit. The medical testimony was more complex, involving questions about which of Harrison's health problems could be attributed to the accident versus his age and pre-existing conditions. Two doctors provided conflicting opinions about the relationship between the accident and Harrison's ongoing symptoms. As I listened to the expert testimony, I was impressed by the thoroughness of both legal teams' preparation. This might be a routine civil case compared to the national security matters I dealt with during my military career, but the attorneys were approaching it with the same attention to detail and commitment to building a persuasive case. During a brief recess, Judge Chen called both attorneys to a sidebar conference that lasted several minutes. When they returned, Walsh looked pleased, while the plaintiff attorney appeared concerned. I suspected there had been some discussion about jury instructions or evidentiary issues. The final witness of the day was Jessica Torres herself, the defendant whose insurance company was being sued. She was a young graduate student who seemed genuinely remorseful about the accident, even while maintaining that she hadn't run a red light.
"I know my testimony contradicts the other witnesses," she said during cross-examination, "but I remember clearly that the light was yellow when I entered the intersection. I would never deliberately run a red light, especially at such a busy intersection." Her sincerity was evident, but so was the conflict between her account and the physical evidence presented by the accident reconstruction expert. It was exactly the kind of credibility determination that juries are designed to make, weighing competing versions of events against the available evidence. As the day's testimony concluded, Judge Chen announced that closing arguments would be presented the following morning, after which the case would go to the jury for deliberation. I realized that Michael and his fellow jurors would soon be facing the responsibility of reaching a verdict based on everything they'd heard. Outside the courthouse, the media presence had intensified rather than diminished. I counted at least 6 news crews, and several reporters approached me as I tried to leave the building. This time, I decided to make a brief statement rather than continuing to avoid their questions. "I'm here as a private citizen observing a legal proceeding," I said to the small group that had gathered around me. "Yesterday's jury selection raised some interesting questions, but today's trial has been focused on the evidence and testimony relevant to the case. That's exactly how our justice system is supposed to work." "Admiral Martinez," one reporter called out, "some people are saying that your questioning yesterday highlights broader issues about how military service is perceived in civilian settings. Do you have any comment on that?" I thought carefully before responding. Military service teaches you to respect institutions and procedures while also thinking critically about complex problems. Those are valuable skills in any context, including jury service. But they're not unique to military personnel. Citizens from all backgrounds bring valuable perspectives to our justice system. Do you think Attorney Walsh's questions were appropriate? Attorney Walsh was doing her job, representing her client's interests by exploring potential sources of bias. When she learned more about my background, she adjusted her approach accordingly. That's exactly what good attorneys do. Another reporter asked, "What message do you think yesterday's events send to other veterans who might be called for jury duty?" I thought carefully before responding. Military service teaches you to respect institutions and procedures while also thinking critically about complex problems. Those are valuable skills in any context, including jury service, but they're not unique to military personnel. Citizens from all backgrounds bring valuable perspectives to our justice system. That evening, Michael called with updates on the jury's discussions during breaks and his impressions of the testimony. "The evidence seems pretty clear," he said, "but there are still some credibility issues to work through. The defendant seems sincere, but her account doesn't match the physical evidence." How are the other jurors approaching the case? Very seriously. Everyone's taking notes and asking thoughtful questions during the jury instruction conference. I think yesterday's events actually made all of us more conscious of our responsibilities. In what way? Well, after all the attention focused on qualifications and bias and proper procedures, we're all being extra careful to base our discussions on the evidence rather than our personal opinions or experiences. That's exactly what I'd hoped would happen. The scrutiny of the jury selection process reminded everyone involved that jury service is a serious responsibility that requires careful attention to evidence and law. Have the other jurors said anything about yesterday's proceedings? A few of them mentioned it. The retired teacher said she was impressed by how you handled the questioning. The mechanic said he learned things about military service that he'd never known before. But mostly people seem focused on the case itself. That's as it should be. The next morning brought the final day of trial proceedings. Closing arguments were scheduled for 9 o'clock, followed by jury instructions and the beginning of deliberations. I arrived at the courthouse to find the media presence had grown even larger, with national news outlets now represented alongside the local reporters. Inside the courtroom, both legal teams appeared ready for their final presentations. Attorney Walsh had prepared a detailed argument focused on the conflicting testimony and the burden of proof in civil cases. She acknowledged the sympathy everyone felt for Harrison's medical problems, but emphasized that sympathy couldn't substitute for proof that those problems were caused by the accident. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, "this case is about evidence, not emotions. The plaintiff asks you to believe that a yellow light was actually red, that pre-existing medical conditions were actually caused by an accident, and that my client should pay for damages she didn't cause."
The evidence simply doesn't support those claims. The plaintiff's attorney responded with a passionate argument about the physical evidence and the reliability of the accident reconstruction analysis. He painted Jessica Torres as a young driver who'd made a serious mistake and was now trying to avoid responsibility for the consequences. "The evidence is clear," he argued. "The defendant ran a red light and caused this accident. Mr. Harrison was an innocent victim who was simply driving through an intersection where he had the right of way. He shouldn't have to bear the financial burden of someone else's mistake." Both closing arguments were well-crafted and persuasive, highlighting different aspects of the evidence and different interpretations of the testimony. As I listened, I was reminded of the advocacy skills I developed during my own legal career and the challenges of presenting complex information in a clear and compelling way. After closing arguments, Judge Chen provided detailed jury instructions covering the applicable law, the burden of proof, and the procedures for deliberation. She explained the difference between criminal cases, where guilt must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and civil cases, where liability must be established by a preponderance of the evidence. "You are the sole judges of the credibility of the witnesses and the weight to be given to their testimony," she told the jurors. "You may believe all, part, or none of any witness's testimony. You should consider each witness's opportunity to observe, their ability to remember, their manner of testifying, and any bias or interest they might have in the outcome of the case." The instructions were comprehensive and clearly delivered, giving the jury the legal framework they needed to evaluate the evidence and reach a verdict. As the jurors filed out to begin their deliberations, I felt confident that they understood their responsibilities and would approach them seriously. During the deliberation period, I spent time in the courthouse cafeteria reading and grading papers while keeping an eye on the media activity outside. Several reporters approached other family members and observers, trying to gather reactions and predictions about the verdict. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, word came that the jury had reached a decision. The courtroom filled quickly as everyone returned for the reading of the verdict. Michael and his fellow jurors looked serious but not stressed, suggesting that their deliberations had been thorough but not contentious. Judge Chen called the court to order and asked the jury foreman, a retired accountant named William Burke, to announce the verdict. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Robert Harrison, and award damages in the amount of $42,000. The verdict represented a compromise between the parties' positions. Harrison had sought over $70,000 in damages, while Torres's insurance company had argued that no damages were warranted. The jury had apparently concluded that the accident had caused some, but not all of Harrison's claimed injuries. After the verdict was read and the jury was dismissed, both legal teams expressed satisfaction with the outcome and the jury's careful consideration of the evidence. Judge Chen thanked the jurors for their service and dismissed them with appreciation for their civic contribution. Outside the courthouse, Michael seemed relieved that his jury duty was complete, but also energized by the experience. "It was more complex than I had expected," he told me as we walked to our cars. "The deliberations were really thorough. Everyone wanted to make sure we'd considered all the evidence carefully." "How long did it take to reach a verdict?" "About 4 hours. We went through all the testimony and evidence systematically, then discussed each element of the case separately. There were some disagreements about the medical evidence, but we worked through them by focusing on what we could actually prove rather than what we suspected might be true." "That sounds like exactly the right approach." "I kept thinking about what you said about following proper procedures and making decisions based on evidence rather than assumptions. It really helped me stay focused on my responsibilities as a juror." As we prepared to part ways, Michael made an observation that stayed with me. "You know, yesterday's controversy actually made me a better juror. All that scrutiny about bias and influence and proper procedures reminded me that jury service isn't just about showing up and giving an opinion. It's about fulfilling a civic obligation with the same professionalism you'd bring to any important responsibility. That evening, I received several phone calls from friends and colleagues who'd seen news coverage of the trial. Some were curious about my military background, which had apparently been discussed in more detail in some of the media reports. Others wanted to understand what the controversy over jury selection had been about. The most meaningful call came from Admiral Patricia Wells, my former commanding officer at Naval Special Warfare Command. "Sarah, I saw the news coverage and wanted to tell you how proud I am of the way you represented the Navy and the JAG Corps." "Thank you, Admiral. It wasn't exactly how I'd planned to spend my winter break." She laughed. "The best leadership opportunities rarely come when we're expecting them. From what I could see, you turned a potentially problematic situation into a teaching moment about military service and civic duty." "I just tried to answer the questions honestly and professionally," which is exactly what we trained you to do. But the broader impact seems to have been significant. My assistant showed me some of the social media reactions, and there's been a lot of positive discussion about military service and the transition to civilian life. We talked for another 20 minutes about current issues in military legal work and the challenges facing veterans in civilian careers. Admiral Wells mentioned that several JAG officers had contacted her asking about the transition to teaching, inspired by my example. The conversation reminded me that our actions often have consequences beyond what we can see or anticipate. What we think of as routine behavior, other people may see as examples worth following. The responsibility that comes with experience and expertise isn't just about making good decisions for yourself, but about modeling the kind of behavior that strengthens institutions and communities. That's ultimately what the jury selection controversy had been about, though none of us understood it at the time. It wasn't really about whether military experience creates bias or whether family relationships compromise objectivity. It was about what we owe each other as citizens and how we can fulfill those obligations with the integrity and professionalism that democracy requires. The answer, I learned, isn't to minimize our backgrounds or pretend that experience doesn't matter. It's to bring our full capabilities to the service of justice and the common good, while remaining humble enough to listen, learn, and adapt when circumstances require it. That's what military service taught me, what jury duty reinforced, and what I try to pass on to my students every day. Because in the end, citizenship isn't about the uniform you wore, or the rank you achieved, or the cases you handled. It's about the commitment you make to serve something larger than yourself, whether that's in a courtroom, a classroom, or wherever else life calls you to make a difference. 3 years had passed since that unexpected Tuesday morning in Courtroom 4B, and the ripple effects continue to spread in ways I never could have imagined. What began as a simple jury selection has evolved into something much larger, touching lives across the country and changing how people think about military service, civic duty, and the obligations we have to one another. Last month, I received an invitation that brought everything full circle. The Arizona State Bar Association was hosting a symposium on military veterans in civilian legal careers, and they'd asked me to deliver the keynote address. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd become a spokesperson for an issue I'd never intended to champion, but sometimes life chooses your platform for you. Standing before an audience of attorneys, judges, law students, and veterans, I found myself reflecting on how that morning in court had fundamentally changed my understanding of what it means to serve. The room was filled with people who were navigating their own transitions between military and civilian life, each carrying their own stories of service and sacrifice. The question isn't whether your military experience makes you different, I told them. The question is whether you're willing to use that difference to make your community stronger. Every skill you developed in uniform, every challenge you overcame, every lesson you learned about integrity and service remains part of who you are. The goal isn't to hide that background, but to apply it constructively in whatever role you choose to fill. In the audience, I spotted several familiar faces.
Attorney Walsh was there, having become something of an advocate for veteran integration into civilian legal careers. She'd started a mentorship program at her firm specifically designed to help military lawyers transition to private practice. David Chen had left insurance defense to become a prosecutor, inspired by what he'd called the Admiral Martinez effect on his understanding of public service. But the most meaningful presence was Michael, who'd driven up from Phoenix specifically to hear my speech. My brother had taken our jury duty experience to heart in ways that surprised both of us. He'd started volunteering with a local organization that helped veterans navigate the civilian legal system, using his law enforcement background to bridge the gap between military and civilian perspectives. You know, he told me afterward, that whole controversy about bias and influence actually taught me something important about my role as a police officer. I realized that my job isn't just about enforcing laws, it's about helping people understand how our justice system works and why it matters. The changes in Michael's approach to his work had been noticed by his department leadership. He'd been promoted to sergeant and assigned to community outreach programs, where his combination of law enforcement experience and newfound appreciation for civic education made him particularly effective. The symposium also featured presentations from other veterans who'd found their own ways to contribute to the legal system. A former Army paralegal had become a victims' rights advocate. A retired Air Force lawyer was teaching constitutional law at a community college. A former Marine had started a nonprofit organization providing legal assistance to homeless veterans. Each story reinforced the same theme that the jury selection experience had taught us all. Military service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It evolves into different forms of service that draw on the same fundamental commitment to something larger than yourself. During the question and answer session, a young law student asked me about the media attention that had followed the trial. Admiral Martinez, do you think the publicity helped or hurt the broader conversation about veterans in civilian roles? It was a thoughtful question that I'd pondered many times over the past 3 years. The attention was unexpected and sometimes uncomfortable, I admitted, but it sparked conversations that needed to happen. Too often we treat military service as something that happened in the past rather than something that continues to shape how veterans contribute to their communities. What's the most important thing you've learned from the experience? That every institution in our society benefits when people bring their best capabilities to the service of others. Military training teaches you to analyze complex problems, make decisions under pressure, and maintain high standards even when it's difficult. Those aren't military skills, they're leadership skills that strengthen any organization or community that's wise enough to recognize and utilize them. After the symposium, I was approached by Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a research professor who'd been studying veteran integration into civilian careers. She'd been following my story and had some fascinating data about its broader impact. Admiral Martinez, we've been tracking jury service participation rates among veterans since your case became public. There's been a measurable increase in veterans volunteering for jury duty and a significant decrease in requests for exemptions based on military service. The statistics were encouraging, but more interesting were the qualitative changes she had documented. Court clicks around the country report that veterans are arriving for jury duty better prepared and more engaged with the process. Several judges have commented that military veterans are asking more thoughtful questions during jury selection and taking their responsibilities more seriously. Dr. Warren's research had also tracked changes in how attorneys approached jury selection when military veterans were in the jury pool. There's been a shift away from automatic challenges of veterans towards more nuanced questioning about how military experience might actually enhance rather than compromise jury service. The academic perspective was validating, but the personal stories continued to be the most meaningful measure of impact. My email inbox regularly filled with messages from veterans who'd been inspired to become more involved in their communities, from spouses who'd gained new appreciation for their partner's military service, from civilians who had never understood what military training actually entailed. One message that particularly touched me came from a high school student in Ohio whose father was a Marine veteran. Admiral Martinez, my dad never talked much about his military service, and I always thought it was because he was ashamed of it or wanted to forget about it. After reading about your experience, I asked him more questions and learned that he was actually proud of his service, but didn't know how to explain it to people who hadn't been in the military. Now we talk about it all the time, and I'm considering a military career myself. The generational aspect of the story's impact hadn't occurred to me initially, but it became increasingly apparent as time passed. Military families often struggle with how to discuss service with children and spouses who haven't shared that experience. The jury selection story seemed to provide a framework for those conversations, demonstrating how military values and training could be relevant and valuable in civilian contexts. Teaching had become even more rewarding as I found new ways to incorporate lessons about civic duty and service into my government classes. My students were fascinated by the jury duty experience, and it provided a perfect case study for discussing how democratic institutions actually work in practice. The most important thing about democracy, I would tell them, isn't voting, though voting matters. It's the willingness of ordinary citizens to take on extraordinary responsibilities when their community needs them, whether that's serving on a jury, joining the military, teaching school, or running for office. Democracy only works when people are willing to serve something larger than themselves. The lessons seem to resonate with students in ways that traditional civics education often didn't. Instead of abstract discussions about government structures, we could talk about real people making real decisions that affected their neighbors' lives. Several of my former students had gone on to pursue careers in public service, citing our discussions about citizenship and responsibility as influential factors in their decision. The jury duty experience had also changed my relationship with other veterans in ways I hadn't anticipated. For years, I'd kept my military service relatively private, sharing details only with close friends and family. But the public nature of the courtroom questioning had connected me with veteran communities I'd never engaged with before. I'd been invited to speak at Veterans Day ceremonies, participate in mentorship programs, and serve on advisory boards for veteran service organizations. Each engagement reinforced the same truth, that military service creates bonds and obligations that persist long after discharge. The most recent invitation had come from the Naval Academy, where they'd asked me to speak to midshipmen about the transition from military to civilian careers. Standing before those young future officers, I was reminded of my own journey from newly commissioned ensign to rear admiral to high school teacher. Your military career will end someday, but your obligation to serve won't. The question you'll face isn't whether to continue serving, but how to find new ways to serve that utilize your training and experience while meeting your community's needs. It was a message I wished someone had shared with me during my own transition from active duty. The move from military to civilian life can feel like a loss of purpose and identity, but it's actually an opportunity to apply everything you've learned in new contexts that can be just as meaningful and impactful. As I drove home from the symposium that evening, I reflected on how a single morning in a courtroom had fundamentally altered the trajectory of my civilian life. I'd gone from being a private